Welcome to episode 96 of Silver Lining for Learning. We're almost approaching 100 episodes of this, and it's amazing. Today, I'm very excited to have two guests that I have admired a lot about school transformation. They're school leaders, they're practitioners, they are in the trenches, and they have truly changed schools. Peter Hutton from Melbourne, Australia, and Michael Ha from Brisbane, Australia. So we will start by asking Peter to introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your school transformation of Templestowe and why you call Templestowe College into TC. Go ahead, Peter.
No worries. Thanks, Yong. So my name is Peter Hutton. I've been an assistant principal or principal for 25 years. My last role as a principal was of a school called Templestowe College. When I took it over, it was dying. It had twice been told by the regional director that it was no longer viable. But in Australia, they won't actually execute a school. They basically bleed you dry of funds, and then the school council has to request to be made defunct. And so twice the regional director had approached the school and said that it wasn't viable. The principal departed, I was appointed. We had 286 students in a secondary school that had once been 1,000. We had 16 acres of space. So that was a lot of young people to be roaming around on that sort of scale. So you could hardly see a student. Over the course of 8 years, and in fact, in my third year, I reached out to Yong Zhao, and he so kindly offered some assistance. And so Yong and I have been working together on the transformation of Templestowe College for the last 6 years that I was there. But during the course of that 8 years, we built the numbers back up to 1,150. In 2 years, in 2017, it was recognised by Finland in the initial 100 most innovative education projects in the first lot of those in the world. We had 80 businesses operating from ideation to operation. Most of them were for-profit businesses. Some were non-for-profit. We had no year levels in the school. So it was conventionally a secondary school, so normally a 6-year duration. Our kids could graduate in 4 years, 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, or 8 years as they chose. No compulsory subjects. We found a loophole in the Victorian regulations, and so we drove the bus through that. Every young person had their own individualised learning plan, which they wrote with the support of their parents and a senior staff member. And we ended up employing 10% of our students on a paid basis to help run the school. One of the things that Yong used to say all the time when he would come to visit was, "Peter, there are still too many adults in this space." And so I really took that to heart. And so we had a rule that we wouldn't employ an adult to do a job that a young person could do with a degree of support. So that's a little bit about the school. And I finished with that school 4 years ago. We did have a discussion about what the style of learning was, and Yong and I debated long and hard whether it was individualised or personalised. And Yong, your invitation to me was, call it something that nobody else knows about, then they can't say that you're not doing it. And so because the school was called Templestowe College, we shortened that to TC and called it Take Control. And so it's the take control model of education, and that's what we want young people to do. It's what we want the staff to do.
And now, Peter, you're leading now a new organization. Why don't you say a few words about that before we move to Michael?
Sure. So towards my final 2 years at TC, Yong said, "Peter, having one school is great. Having 10 schools would be better." And again, I took your advice. Sort of feel a little bit resentful about that last one because I left a job that was it was the best job ever, being principal of TC. The place essentially ran itself. I just kept walking around looking surprised at all the great things that young people and adults were doing. It literally ran itself. But I ended up appointing a co-principal who could then succeed me and continue on the work. And I started working with 5 other schools. And when I left TC, that became the Future Schools Alliance. That number quickly grew to 20, then to 50. Then we were aiming at 100, and we went into COVID. We still ended up with 75. We've now got 100 schools across Australia, independent schools, state schools, faith-based schools, etc. And we support those schools to innovate. So it's the exploration and promotion of future-focused learning.
Thank you so much. Now, Michael, you had a very interesting personal life before you come to education. Now you've been leading schools, you've been leading innovations. Now you are going to build a new school. Can you introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your new school, your innovation, and then we have other questions.
Yeah, hello. Thanks for inviting me to this webinar today. My name's Michael. I'm the founding principal of Element College in Noosa, Australia. And I guess my journey started with the TC journey, really, back when it was Templestowe College days. So I migrated to Australia when I was in year 4 or 4th grade, when I was 9. And I didn't speak a word of English. And this primary school that I went to was literally next door to Templestowe College. And it was sitting above the hill where primary school is, and TC was down here. My vivid memory of Templestowe College was that the high school students used to throw rocks up the hill at us. And that was my first memory of Australia. And I thought, wow, what a school, and what is this, having grown up, having schooling in Hong Kong prior to that. So my connection, I guess, with Peter started, even though he wasn't there, all the way back. And, you know, having started my education career and then following the journey and learning a lot from Peter and, you know, and Yong as well, I started to really look at, okay, well, if there's so many people and organization out there saying that education really needs to change, talking about the why, and also what needs to change, what about the how? I'm a very solutions focused person. I like to see action. And, you know, even like listening to the conversation of this panel on the UNESCO report a few months ago, you know, you talk about, you know, there's the why, but the how, like what happens next, right? You get a report and it just, like, you know, it sits there for 5 years and then there's another report. Nothing ever's changed. So I was really fortunate to be appointed in this position of a founding principal, where the board is quite forward thinking in changing the game of school. We're looking at what learning means for lifelong learners. So not only for children, not only for teenagers, but also for adults as well. And really looking at what it might mean if we were to remove the school walls. We're still in this model where a lot of, like, you know, majority of learning happens within the school walls. So if we were to remove that, what might it look like? And really designing the entire learning, schooling, education experience from the ground up, and also still tick the box, because ultimately at the moment, a lot of schools that cry out and say, we can't do, like, you know, we can't change, we can't innovate because of these boxes. My ultimate dream is to create a playbook and say, well, these are the boxes, I made it work. And these are the questions that you don't have to follow what I do, because everyone has their own unique context. But these were the wonderings that I went through and the problems that I had to try and solve while we did that. So this, you know, sort of like a blueprint of questions to think about while you're trying to create an education or learning ecosystem that's fit for purpose.
Thanks, Michael. That's very, I know a lot about both of you guys' schools. So now, Chris, you have a comment or question?
Well, I have a question, and I know that we're going to spend most of our time in the show talking about the how. How is the process really different than a conventional school? But I wanted to talk about the output. Right, so I'd be interested for each of you if you would say something like, if many of my students had gone to a traditional school, they would have come out with X. And in going to my school, they came out with Y. I'd love to hear that, because ultimately the process is in service of the outcome.
Peter or Michael, you want to go first? Anyone can go. Oh, I'll just call you. Peter,
Okay, I'll jump in. I think that's a great question, Chris. Although I'll give you a caveat, if you don't mind, and that is that in schools we too often focus on the output, as though the 6 years that they spend with us don't really matter. You know, it's about living your life every day, not in service of some time in 6 years hence. And I think that too much of school is literally focused on this obsession of preparing people for the future. How about we prepare them for now? That'd be a good thing. So to your question though, how would a student perhaps that came out of TC look different? I would say that some of them will have a qualification, whereas they wouldn't had they been in a traditional school. So we know from research that the same proportion of people drop out of Harvard as drop out of some of the perhaps lesser known universities, even though we know that the academic quality can vary greatly, and that's because of relative perception on academic standing. And, you know, I think a lot of those students who came through TC would have dropped out and not had completed their secondary schooling because they didn't feel that they fit within the traditional model in most schools, even though they were capable. So, you know, many of the young people that drop out of school, it's not through lack of academic ability, it's because they don't fit, they don't feel valued, they don't feel seen. So some will come out with a qualification. The other thing is learning confidence. You know, in traditional schools, and we all know this, but like the measure of success is this broad, you know, literacy, numeracy, and some science. You know, if they're good at sport, that's seen as a nice addition, but you know, that's not really the main game. Whereas our young people, I would like to think all came out with learning confidence, because we never like, why do we extend people beyond their demonstrated level of capacity simply because, you know, they're in year 9, they're 15, and it says this is the curriculum, even though they didn't manage the curriculum, you know, that was presented to them 3 years ago. Like, you know, if you designed a system to break a kid's learning confidence, you couldn't do a better job of the step-by-step, you know, succession model. The other thing that young people left TC with, I always said I wanted them to leave with 3 things. I wanted them the key to the front door, which was a pathway where they could walk straight into their next level, you know, whether that be an apprenticeship, whether it be a university course, a TAFE, you know, vocational college, etc. But we ideally wanted them to have keys to the front door. I then wanted them to have sorry, I shouldn't do that, doesn't look good. I then wanted them to have keys to the back door. And the back door was another pathway that they could end up in the same place, but perhaps not through the front door. So perhaps starting with a certificate and then moving to a diploma and then getting into a degree course. Like, how could they essentially find a back door into the same place? And the other thing that we wanted them to do, and we didn't achieve this as much as the first 2, but we also wanted them to have some form of their own self-employment. And so what that was something that they could pick up, you know, relatively low barriers to entry and exit in terms of money and time and setup and so on. But if and when, and I think that's the important thing, when they found themselves unemployed or underemployed, they could start up a small business, whether it be lawn mowing, window cleaning, dog walking, whatever their particular thing was, a massage course, etc., so that they could perhaps earn, you know, $15, $20 an hour, so that they were never unemployed or underemployed. And that makes a massive difference to young people's learning confidence when they know that they can back themselves when, you know, they find themselves out of regular employment.
Thanks, Peter. Michael, you have anything to add?
Yeah, similarly, you know, how, I guess, what might that look like on the grounds? Ideologies, you know, for me, I love every learner coming out of their experience with us to be caring, to be courageous, and to be curious, right? Those are the ideals that I think, you know, would really take them through the next phase in life, no matter what they do. But to scaffold them my idea is that every student will have, throughout their whole schooling, a well-being mentor and also an entrepreneur mentor as well. So it's funny that when I develop learning programs and you say to a student, hey, here's a passion project, find something you're passionate about and try and make it happen, or start a business, right? A lot of students that have gone through traditional schooling, they've gone through a system where everything is spoon-fed to them, and they can't really think for themselves, or can't really even unpack what they want or what they're striving towards. So by providing them a scaffold to be able to learn those skills and to really increase their backpack of repertoire of, like, of ways that they can problem solve an idea, I think that's really important. And looking at things like even the design thinking process, that's a really good strategy, because every phase there are multiple activities that you can use to really unpack a big idea into smaller ideas.
Great, thanks, Michael. Puneet.
Sure, I have so many questions to ask, but I think I'll start with particularly about how the school fits within the larger system. But I'll start with a different question for this one. Maybe we can circle back on that later. So one of the things is that there are always skeptics to whenever you come up with an idea like this, where you say students can be in charge of their learning, that they can develop their own, and they can do all of these things that we think that they are ready to do. And the skeptics usually will say, oh, this works for a certain kind of student, and the answer, and the certain kind would either be, their background and, how much money their parents are making and the kind of support they have at home, or it would be that they are intrinsically motivated and they sort of know what their passions are, which most students don't. So twofold, can you give us a profile of the student community or community within which it exists? That is this representative of the broader world that we live in, or is it something select? Because that's one skepticism. And the second one is, I think that's sort of the point, is like, how do you talk to the skeptics about this, that this works for all learners, not just for some special group based on their either family, socioeconomic background, or their personal characteristics?
Great question.
Michael, why don't you? Yeah, go ahead, Peter.
Sorry. I'll jump in now that I'm off mic. But I guess what I would say is I don't really need to convince the skeptics or enroll them, because there are enough people who the system has actually churned through and broken that we can enroll them and fill, 500 schools. Because the current school system has literally broken the spirit of so many young people and their families that we, there's just a massive target market there. Australia holds the not too impressive statistic of having the third most disengaged young people in the OECD, behind France and the Slavic Republic. Prior to COVID, we had evidence to say that 40% of our kids were disengaged at any one time. During COVID, that dropped to more than 60% disengaged. So I would contend that we don't actually need to convince the skeptics, because many of those skeptics the traditional system actually works well for. But what I would like, I don't want all schools to look like ours. What I want is for every young person to have the opportunity to attend a school like ours that genuinely values them as an individual, wants to see them succeed rather than put them through a batch process. So, what I would say is I want every young person to truly say, I love my school. So we're starting a school in 2023, hopefully in Melbourne CBD, and that is our measure. Do you love this school? To the parents, do you love the school that your young people are enrolled in? To the teachers, do you love being a teacher here? And if we can't say yes confidently to that, then we've still got more work to do. So to the skeptics, I say continue with the production line model, and to those who want to have an enjoyable education that's meaningful, that's fulfilling, and in my view will take them further, they're the people that we want to talk to.
Yeah, and I think with with Element College, I sort of take a little bit of a different approach. I've been thinking long and hard about this, and the current model actually, as Peter said, suit a sub-cohort of students. And we don't want to completely change the model where we then don't fit those students that currently suit the traditional model. So, and also if you're talking about schooling in general, that's only a day school we're talking about. What about students that learn better online? What about homeschooling families? So with Element College, we've actually designed a complete learning ecosystem where eventually we'll have a day school, a distant education school, and also a learning hub for homeschool families. And what we found in the startup phase of this operation is that the learning hub component, because it's running at such a small scale, it's much easier to start with. So since December last year, in 5 weeks, I managed to start a learning hub here in Noosa, Australia, where we cater to 200 homeschool families. From the conceptualization phase to design phase to implementation phase, it took less than 5 weeks. So that in itself is financially viable, where it would actually buy us some time to then look at the regulations and all the policies in starting the distant education school and also the day school ultimately as well. So we're looking at catering to all students and all learners. And it's funny when people say, oh, well, what's your, are you starting an alternate learning model? And I say, no. If you look at our model, our logo, it's 6 circles that intersects in the middle. And I think what we want to look at is what does that middle and those surrounding joint areas actually look like? Because we want to take the best of everything. We don't want to, reinvent the wheel, because there are lots of good things that's actually happening in education worldwide. So why don't we look at what does that intersection actually look like, and whether we can actually utilize that to create these meaningful learning experiences for learners.
Thank you. There was a second part to my question. Can either of you address that in terms of are your schools selective in terms of who comes in the door, or is it open to anybody and everybody? I mean, I think that's another piece that people often talk about, that we can see that in the US, where charter schools, for instance, as a parallel system, where they don't have to do a lot of the things that public schools are expected to do, and often sort of drive away students who aren't doing well in order to show that they're actually succeeding wildly, right? So can you speak to that, in terms of the profile of students and families who your schools are serving? Are they broadly representative of the community as a whole?
Peter's an expert on this because he's worked out the magic key within the Australian system, and so I'll pass it on to him.
Thanks for that hand pass there, Michael. I was working with an institution who administers the funding, and they were explaining to me that the amount of government funding, and in Australia, independent schools receive government funding. And they were telling me that it was based on the median income of families. And I sort of, being a maths teacher, I haven't used the word median in anger since learning about it when I was at school. I've gone the median, the middle one, the middle income. And they said, yes. And I've gone, so that means if you skew your population, and so you have 55 or 51% of your kids from low or no income, then you get full funding for all of them. And they said, yes, that's right. I almost hit the floor. That is awesome. So part of our reason for starting this school is that we will start with 55% of our kids on healthcare cards or low or no income, and that will actually maximize funding from the government, where we will end up with around $19,000 per student, whereas when I was in a state school, I was educating for $7,500. So that's just bizarre, but found the loophole, and we're going to build a school on that basis. So yes, it will be representative, and it will scale, I would imagine, very, very quickly. All we need is the founding capital for the first school to ignite the fire, if you will, and then it will take off.
That's
I
wonderful.
just want to say that.
Thank you for sharing that.
Templestowe, Peter, the old school you had was open. It was a state school. You
Yep.
take everybody, right? In that, yeah.
Right. I mean, the reason I ask that is that's often the point that people make, right? Oh, if you select, if you do X, if you have this, if you exist in such and such a community, then all of these great ideas work. It does, and that is, I mean, it's a terrible argument to make. It is morally questionable at best, but it is one that is made. So, which is why I was sort of pushing it.
By the way, Peter, I'm sorry. I just want to add that, I'm running an experiment in China in the school. They always ask us to select the students. Well, Michael, you joined that. I said, no, we refuse to select students. We say we just want everyone to be, whoever wants to be in can be in. But it's very hard. It's, in a system, in a Chinese system, always want you to select, pick the best one, all those things. I know, Kurt, you have a question. Go ahead, Kurt.
Yeah. This is not a religious show. And I do want us to make it to show 100. I don't want us to be kicked off the airways, but I must ask you this question. As you're describing, Peter, your school, you use words like fulfillment, meaningfulness, learning confidence. You have people live for the moment, live for today, not for the future. You have people can walk in and take a path through the front door, go in the path through the back door. And, my quote for the day from the Dalai Lama was, with realization of one's own potential and self-confidence in one's ability, one can build a better world. Now, according to my own experience, self-confidence is very important. You said, learning confidence, and the Dalai Lama goes on, that sort of confidence is not blind. It is the awareness of one's own potential. On that basis, human beings can transform themselves by increasing the good qualities and reducing negative qualities. Were you building these principles based on your readings of Buddhist religion? I'm just curious. It can just be a simple yes/no answer, or I don't know.
Interesting question, Kurt. I've had dalliances with Buddhism, with Christianity, with Taoism. So there's an innate seeking, I guess. But I've always believed that, we're going to call it a school, so it will be called the Future School of Entrepreneurship and Social Impact. But really, it's just called a school so that people know what it is. But we're actually trying to develop a new sort of social organisation, because we want it to extend well beyond a traditional school day. So in Australia, Australian kids spend more time in school, along with Denmark, miles more than any other country, right? Those two are outliers. We spend 5 years of compulsory education more than Finland in terms of total hours. But in Australia, our kids are only in class for 17% of their waking hours. If you're assuming that they're sleeping 8 hours a day, they're at school for 22%. So if you add lunch and recess, 22% of their waking hours. Kids feel like they're always at school, but the reality is that they're not. So the school that we're looking at starting is so financially viable that we're actually going to open the school 365 days a year. Just let that one sink in, 365 days. So they're not required to attend 365 days, obviously. Right. And in a legal sense, we'll be running a traditional school, 200 school days, and we'll be running a weekend program, before and after school care, and a holiday program. But the point is that there'll be caring adults that the young people will know there 365 days, 7 in the morning till 7 at night, and then ultimately 7 hours of online contactability once we reach scale. So it's a long way of saying, but it is a new form of social organisation that perhaps, in Australia, the role of churches is becoming, perhaps dropping off a little bit. But this is almost like a new form of community. We want to enrol the parents as much as we do the young people.
So that leads to the question I want to ask, but I want to give Michael a chance to answer that first part, because you're really talking about following the middle path around the circles, getting to that middle circle. Did you have a response to that question about Buddhism?
I think, as I said, we want our students to be great human beings ultimately, and to make a positive contribution to the world when they eventually hopefully not finish their learning journey with us ever. We want to build like a hub where like even adults can come in and learn. So I think ultimately that's where our mindset is. When we're talking about back to your first point, what Peter was speaking about the school being like part of the community, we want school to be the central hub of the local community. Back in the village days, the schooling or the education or the learning is an elder really passing on the knowledge, and learners learn by doing. So I want to take some of that approach, and all the learners actually making a contribution to the village. So why can't students be spending a lot of the time working in shops in the local community, engaging with the local community? Why can't they be looking at the traffic management system of the local area and making some suggestions back to the council, the local council, and improving the area and the community that we live in initially, and then look wider abroad globally as well. So that's where we sit in terms of our philosophy.
Okay, so I'll go to part two. And Dodzy, who's in our audience, we're going to ask your question. We're going to hold off until after I'm done. I think Chris is going to go after me, but we'll get to it, Dodzy. So Peter, you mentioned what was significant about what you did in TC, and you mentioned having 80 businesses around. People can understand entrepreneurship and innovation. You talked about no year levels, no compulsory subjects, individualized learning plans, whether it's personalized or individualized. You talk about student employability and taking control of their own learning. That's from your perspective, kind of the person setting all this up and the people who helped you do so. I wonder, as a former educational psychologist, maybe you always are one when you're trained to be one, if an educational psychologist was to come into your building and look for the learning principles that are embedded in what might they see in terms of student learning or teacher learning that are embedded in the TC school? Or maybe not from an educational psychologist perspective, maybe from a parent perspective, a teacher perspective, or a student perspective. What would be the learning principles or the aspects of the ecology of learning that's taking place in there, whether it be inquiry-based learning or project-based learning? So, and the same question for Michael.
I'm not really sure that I have a neat answer for you there, Kurt, because I'm certainly not against, explicit instruction. If a young person wants to know something, let's explicit away. Inquiry, I love inquiry, problem-based learning. So if you had to put a tag on it, at the new school, I would certainly say, yes, it'll probably be largely project-based learning, but the kids will actually, because in order to get funded in Australia, you have to deliver the national curriculum. I call it the legacy curriculum, all the stuff that we've been told is important and hasn't been for, several decades. So they will actually complete that asynchronously. And we've got a program that can deliver that online. So most students, I would assume, will do it at home. And then when they come to school, in the new school, they'll be running their own businesses, running social action projects. If they want to bring the stuff to school and learn communally, then that will be fine. That's in the future school, and that's what it's called, the Future School of Entrepreneurship and Social Enterprise, or Social Impact, sorry. At TC, some of the kids, because to Panya's point, some of them, we were just their neighbourhood school, and they didn't want to flex their curriculum in any great way. They quite liked it. So we divided the classes, but we were explicit and in our explanation. So we had student-led electives where the student, if they enrolled in that, they knew that they were taking the lead on the curriculum. They'd have to come up with the motivation, the question, what they were going to do. And then we had curriculum-specified electives. And if you took a curriculum-specified elective, if you walked along the corridor and looked into the classrooms, it would just look like any other normal school because the kids had chosen that. Some kids chose the majority of their subjects as student-led and they were fully self-organised and motivated. Others chose curriculum specified electives. And from a psychologist point of view, it was interesting. Sometimes a young person, as they do, was going through challenging times, you know, external to the school. And we would often see them move from a more expansive, self-driven, self-organised way of learning, and then they would go into a period where they did more curriculum-specified electives because, frankly, they didn't have the cognitive space to be able to, you know, be self-motivated, and so they wanted to be told what to do, and that's fine. Like, that was, you know, it was a great opportunity to initiate a discussion.
Michael?
Yeah, and I think, like, you know, it's on a similar line there. If you look at all the pedagogies and all the teaching and learning styles around, as we know, there's no one size fit all for every learner. So, and different stages of learning. So I think there are opportunities for explicit instructions, especially in those early foundational years, in their literacy and numeracy, basic literacy and numeracy skills. And then as they grow older, you want to then scaffold them for them to be able to increase their agency to ultimately be able to drive their learning and drive their life as well. Similar to, like, you know, a lot of ideas that Yong really pushes.
Thanks.
Thanks. Chris, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, so Michael, you used a word that really resonates with me, which is ecosystem. And I think that what research shows is that within a school, there should be an ecosystem of pedagogies. And you've talked about that it's not like there's a one-size-fits-all instructional approach, that in the organization of the school, there should be an ecosystem of roles that educators can play and that students can play, and that in the positioning of schools within a community, there should be an ecosystem of learning that the school creates with the surrounding parts of the community. And I mean, all of this seems common sense, really, to me. I mean, I'm not saying that this is some exotic prescription, but in fact, it is so hard to get people to think this way because there's this endless quest for the one-size-fits-all best model of teaching, the one-size-fits-all best model of running a school, the one-size-fits-all model of positioning a school within a community, and it's very frustrating. And I applaud your thinking about ecosystems, and I'm wondering what advice you might have. Suppose that I'm head of a school, and it's a very good conventional school, and I really have mastered how to run the school. So I feel that in a sense that I'm at a stable point, but I'm not growing, I'm not learning, the school isn't changing. What advice would you have for somebody like that if they wanted to move towards more of this complex system model of a school and the people in it?
Yeah, I think the one-size-fits-all model, or the traditional, what some might call the industrial model, comes from the idea that it's easily scalable and it's cost efficient and effective as well. So when schools, a lot of the times when I speak to leaders and say, hey, we want to look at a different model of doing something a bit different, a lot of the answers always come back to, but our timetabling or our staff timetabling doesn't cater to that. And I always have wondered, like, you know, even early in my teaching career, well, then why don't we scrap the timetable? Or why don't we change it? We don't have to scrap it, but why don't we change it? Why don't we think about it a little bit differently, right? So what I've done is, I guess, I used a little bit of the first principles that Elon Musk sort of talks about a lot, and broke down the essential elements of learning, schooling, and education to look at what's really essential. And from those particular pieces, slowly built them back together where we look at what's a minimum viable product. So when the schools say we spend $15 million, an independent school in Australia, to build a building, do we really need to spend $15 million to cater for 100 students? At the moment, at my learning hub at Element College, we spent 100th of that amount, right? And I managed to build that or refurbish that area in less than 5 weeks. And and to see the smile on the students' face when they come through this learning hub and this learning environment, that's priceless to me. And every school leader I've spoken to say, that I've told them the figure of our startup costs have always had their jaws dropped. But essentially, if you break down to what's really, really essential, that's it doesn't actually cost much to have a learning environment. It could be an old office or an old shed that's got a table and chair, and that's all you really need. So to then say, okay, well, we must really need $15 million to build a new building, that in itself is a fallacy. We don't want to go in education space race with everybody, which seems to be happening in the independent sector. So ultimately, I guess what the point I'm trying to get to is through this learning experience, and Peter and I talk a lot, we share our ideas a lot. That's why a lot of them do have lots of crossover. Ultimately, what we want to do is to create a playbook where we share our thinking, our ideas on how it could possibly look like, or the style of questions you might want to ask yourself if that's the way you want to approach it. So a school that already have millions and millions of dollars that are swimming very, very nicely and want to innovate, fantastic, because half the worry, or a little bit of a hurdle for Peter and I is to get that startup funding, and the school already has that. So there's actually no excuse for a current school, to say there is no money or we can't innovate.
Frankly, I think we build buildings because we don't know what else to do. It's a good way to get it off your balance sheet is to build a building.
Too much money. Yeah,
absolutely. The only other thing I'd just like to drop in with Chris, in terms of why the system doesn't move, and how do we? It is common sense. We all know it is. Every report that's generated says the same thing. We don't need any more case for change, and we don't need any more how to do it. We actually know all of those things. What we're short on is delivery. And, I always go back to Yong's point, and I've said this earlier, that there are too many adults around here. I've seen so many schools say as their starting point, well, if we're going to empower the kids, we've got to empower the staff. Now, I'm going to say something a little bit controversial. I disagree. I don't think we should empower the staff. I think we should get rid of a number of the staff to then make room for the young people to step in and occupy that space. I don't see such a dichotomy between teachers and students. Teachers should, learn, how many of our teachers are innumerate? They don't have numeracy. At our school, I'm going to say, hey, you should do the numeracy class. We'll pay you to go and do the numeracy class. Model to the young people that you are still learning, And so what I'm saying, I'm not talking about disempowering the teachers, but our ratio will be as basically maxed out at around 1 to 25 teachers versus students. And so we'll use that money with the students are then able to go and buy in expert advice from people outside the system. But if we have too many adults, they end up taking over the learning, because they're and bless them, in a normal school, they'd be the best teachers. But I've had to say to some teachers, hey, mate, all these, I can sell you to 100 schools, but here you're doing all the learning for the kids. I need you to sit back and be a little bit more quiet and let the kids actually run this show.
Peter and Michael, I have to jump in here because Chris asked a very important question. Number one, I have really been against schools building new buildings. And there are many people ask me, so which school has the most innovative building? Where do I go have this? So why do you always think about dig a hole? You can you can learn in the hole, and there's a lot to learn in the hole. That's really. And another thing is that I really think about the adults. All the schools. One of the things I dislike a lot about pizza. But one of the things is this thing out of pizza says, The quality of our education system relies on the quality of teachers. I said, what about those schools without teachers in the beginning? So we at every system, like in your New South Wales, we got to invest more to recruit high quality graduates into teacher education. We got to train them, retain them, PD them. I said, no, nonsense. So anyway, I had to jump in here. I know, Puneet, you were going to ask the other question, so go ahead.
No, thank you. I love this discussion. And anyway, so there's a question from a longtime listener, Dodzy, which came a while back. So I want to make sure that we get to that. And I think it does connect, Peter, with the point that you were making right now about getting learners to be in charge. So the question was, do you mind elaborating more on the steps you take to build confidence in these young people? Any specific courses or activities? And how do you know or measure, identify the results of this increase in confidence? And so I think the broader point, Peter, that you were making, and I think, Michael, you would agree, is this of moving adults out of that space, getting kids to take that learning. But how does that actually play out? How do you get, because one of the challenges I think I'm sure you face is that students have a preconceived notion of what their role in that space called school is. And so it will require, just as you spoke about, Peter, about this teacher is like, you are doing more than you need to do in some way. So I think students also have these scripts in their head about what their behavior or what they're expected to do. How do you change those scripts? I think is a broader frame of Dodzy's question. So either of you go first, and then,
Happy to jump in. I've got an answer for everything. I think the second part of the question is easier, and that's how can you tell that it's working? You can just feel that. Like, you don't need a metric for it. You walk around it, you see kids making, decisions autonomously. They're not asking for permission, getting a toilet pass, to use a bathroom, for goodness sake, basic human right. You just see them in the space. You see it in the way they talk to adults as equals. There's no pretense of hierarchy and so on. So the measurement thing is like, well, it's not, it's a I've forgotten the word.
You might want to share about your
qualitative.
Qualitative, that's the word I was after.
If I can
just share about that, your students running that conference for other schools and consulting, that would be a good way to gauge the confidence.
Yeah. So, they ran all of the, a stack of businesses. We had around 40 to 60 educators coming through the school every week. The young people did all the liaison for those visits. They did the tours. They answered the questions. They catered for the meal, which they were paid to do. And then they did the follow-up questions at the end. Like the capabilities, but that was built on the basis of, after 6 years. The point that I did want to make is, and I've spoken to many, innovative educators or innovative learning environments people about this. We believe that it takes about 1 month of formalized schooling to undo kids' their assumptions around school. So if they've done 6 years of a primary school, that's at least the first 6 months of their first year in secondary gone before they even, can start taking on some of those things. When we would run our induction camp, we would wear like these T-shirts that had, whose education is this? If it's your education, why am I the one doing all the work? And we gave all of those T-shirts to the staff, to start inculcating those, those messages. But the other thing, and this came up earlier, when you ask students, how would you like to change school? It's a ridiculous question, all right, because they've only been there. It's their first time round. We've seen, 7, 8, 9 cohorts go through. So they don't know what they don't know. So we always say, don't I've got a way around that, but don't necessarily ask them, how would you like to change school? But when they're doing projects, the worst thing that we had is we said, you can do anything, you can study anything, you can do anything at TC, provided it doesn't take too much time, too much money, or negatively impact on somebody else. So that was a rule. It was called the yes is the default policy. Any student, staff, or parent who wanted to change their experience of school, the answer had to be yes, unless it, as I said, took too much time, too much money, negatively impacted on somebody else. So we had all these kids taking up these like super exciting projects, miles beyond what they could possibly land, And you know, the assistant principal and I are going to go, oh, they, you know, when this crashes, when this plane just hits the ground, the kids are going to learn, you know, they're going to scale back their, you know, their aspirations. They'll develop resilience, etc. No, that wasn't what happened at all. What we had was kids walking around telling each other, don't try anything, they won't support you, right? Which was exactly the antithesis of what we wanted. And so we've gone, no, we want you to try these things. And so we developed something called the supported model, the student supported model. So I said to our assistant principal, I need them to smell the fear of failure. So when they take on a project, you let them get to the point where they feel like it's going to die. And then I want you to pick them up and carry them to the line, and if necessary, throw them over. Okay, and so kids would take on these projects, we'd get the staff around them and they'd land it. And for a while there, I've got to say, I was thinking to myself, these are not genuinely student run. Like, there's a lot of staff input happening behind the scenes with this, and I was feeling disingenuous. But over time, what we found was that kids came up with similar projects and we could refer them back to somebody who'd already done something similar. And you'd hear them say, oh, well, when I did this, I contacted this person and I ran a survey and I, developed this online thing. And I'm thinking, you didn't do that at all. Sally did that, our assistant principal. But to them, they couldn't see the disconnect, because adults do things for young people so much all the time. They thought they had done it. But over time, we developed the bank of experience in students. Sorry, I know that was a very long-winded response, but I hope it answered the question.
Yeah, no, I there's something I just want to follow up. This is something that a close friend of mine who works in India said, that the need for data is a function of your distance from the phenomenon. So the fact that that your initial statement, Peter, that you can see, you don't need to do some kind of an evaluative measure to show that these students are actually doing it, because you are right there. And I think very often in education, the further we go from the phenomena of actual classrooms and learning environments, the more we emphasize or need these numbers and averages and standard deviations. So I think that was just a really good point. Michael, I know you have some thoughts. So
yeah, and I think very often we always focus on the outcome or the endpoint of learning, whether it be a test or some presentation, or we're built towards some grand, celebration of learning. But what we really don't focus or have as much attention on is the learning journey or the learning process. So getting students to really reflect on that learning journey from start to finish, it's really, really important. And we just don't do that as much. What happens, let's say a student was 3D printing a model, a piece for their game board that they're designing. They would have went through about 20, 30 iterations through that process. And, whether it might be too big or might be too small, or the printer didn't work, those moments where they fail and they learn, it's worth celebrating and worth documenting and worth reflecting on as well. And I think if we were to focus more on that learning journey, as well as celebrating what happens at the end, that in itself, it's a great way of documenting the growth of that particular student. Back to your first point around what needs to happen in a school, and similar to what Peter spoke about, students don't know what they don't know. Teachers know what they know. So it's often the teachers that need to be unschooled. That's where I think it has the most benefit. Most area of growth. Teachers need to really relook at the ways that we're supporting, scaffolding, and guiding our learners.
I know Kurt has a question, but I just want to add one point, is that when I visit many schools say, oh, we always ask students' opinion about what education they want. I said, why? Because they've been through only one type of education. They have not done research about education. What do you expect them to tell you? That is actually one of the most interesting things. Is why do you ask them? They don't know. Well, if they did research on education, if they read books, they watch YouTube, they talk to Peter, talk to Michael, there may be some value. So that's, I think people always say, oh, we have a student on our school board. I said, how is that helping, you know? So anyway, go ahead, Kurt.
I'm just trying to get the microphone. I'm going to teach a new class in the fall. It's not necessarily a new class in my department, but new for me on designing learning environments. And I'm going to have students kind of track maybe 15 different types of learning environments for the 15 different weeks, maybe triple that. I may quadruple that. I don't know. I haven't designed it yet. And also interview people who have designed them. So with your permission, I might have my students contact each of you next fall. But I'm wondering if either of you can recommend resources, because our audience will be interested in this too, on designing innovative learning environments the way you have. Have you written such documents? Have you been on other podcast shows like this you might refer us to? Has the Australian government profiled you in best cases kind of thing? What would you recommend to someone who might be interested in designing new learning environments? What should they do?
I think the first thing to think about is that learning can happen anywhere, anytime. So the fact that we're, like, our initial thought is a closed space, that in itself should be broadened. I actually ran a design activity with 9th and 10th graders about 6 years ago now on this exact same topic. And what I did was I engaged those students with local architects that are in the education field to really think about a space that we had at our school to redesign learning. And most of them, what was interesting was that 4 out of the 5 groups at the end didn't use the space that I assigned initially. Most of them went outside. So I think that, to me, that was a big alarm bell to me, or a light bulb moment to me. We need to think more broadly around where learning can occur. Could it happen outside? Could it happen, I'm very fortunate that where our school's going to be, it's one of the only biospheres in the world. So, a lot of our learning, 50% of our learning will happen outdoors and within the local community. So what that would do also is that it means the physical space that we need for our school really sort of reduced by almost half, because only half the students will be there at any given time. They're engaging and working alongside local businesses as well. So I think my advice is think more broadly around where or what learning could look like, rather than thinking of a confined space. I read an article just 2 days ago on the most innovative school in Australia, because they've created this room that's hexagon in shape with 3 TVs. There's no front of the classroom and no courts. And I just, it blew my mind. My jaw dropped, and it was actually a funny moment. What would that look like in I don't know, in a shed, in someone's backyard? Could we replicate that? Do we really need 3 TVs? Could it be a TV on wheels? I don't know. Yeah.
Well, thanks for giving me some ideas, Michael. We don't have much time left, but Peter needs to take a stab at this before we introduce the next show.
Yeah, I would just think of a co-working space. So I would, rather than looking at existing learning places, Kurt, I would think of going to libraries, co-working spaces, those sorts of things. The other thing is think flexibility at all costs. So nothing that's fixed. And I'm saying even including walls, like getting kids to have systems of dividers that can be used up. And I would actually allow them to regularly reassess how the space is used.
Peter, mention your book before I introduce next episode. All right.
I'm not sure. Currently, because I'm dyslexic myself, I'm currently having the audio book done, but it should be available there. I can try and find it and pop it in the chat. But Turning Around a Troubled School.
I've read this book. I've wrote an endorsement for the book, actually forward. It's a beautiful book, wonderful book, since it matches what Peter's beard, so it looks very nice. So thank you, Michael and Peter. This is a wonderful, wonderful episode, and I think it gives us a sense to say how schools can be transformed, especially when you talk about we don't need a lot of money. I think many people, in education, they always think, where can I get money? Where can I get a grant? I think actually it can be done, and you've done it, and thank you very much. Our next episode is host reflection, just the four of us, Christy of Harvard, Puneet Mishra of Arizona State, Kurt Bunk of Indiana, and Yong Zhao from Kansas and the University of Melbourne. We're going to reflect on the last 4 episodes, and they all have to do with the people who have done amazing things. And we have deans, we have superintendents, we have school principals, and this is just great. So looking forward to seeing all of you next week.